Ancient Greece, a complex society known for its achievements in politics, warfare, the arts, and much more. It's certainly worth asking, what food fueled such an accomplished society? When you picture the food of ancient Greece, you might imagine lavish banquets with overflowing plates of roasted meats and endless cups of wine. The reality for most, however, was very different, and in many ways, far more influential. In this video, we will explore this topic, uncovering the true diet of ancient Greece, from the humble staples that powered its people to the surprising dishes that have shaped the way we eat today. Naturally, as with all societies, the Greek diet was fundamentally defined by a certain frugality, born from the rocky, challenging terrain of the region. It was built upon a foundation that historians call the Mediterranean triad: cereals, olives, and grapes. These three pillars were foundational to their civilization. But it's also important to note that legumes, like lentils and beans, were of great importance, especially for the poor. Within this framework existed a fascinating world of contrast. There was the austere, disciplined diet of the common person, and then there were the luxurious, elaborate feasts of the wealthy elite. So, how did the average person eat, and what did they aspire to? Let's get to it, starting with their first meal of the day. The ancient Greeks of the classical era seem to have generally structured their day around 2 or 3 meals, with dinner being the most significant. Their schedule looked quite different from ours, as they valued daylight for work, meaning midday meals were often light or even skipped entirely. The day began with akrotisma, or breakfast. This was a simple, functional meal, often consisting of barley bread, similar to a modern rusk, dipped in unmixed wine. For the record, the meal, akrotisma, gets its name from this practice of dipping bread in akrotos oinos, or undiluted wine. To go with the bread, they might have had a few figs or olives. It was quick, practical, and gave them the energy to start their work. The midday meal, ariston, was also a light affair, if eaten at all. It might include some salted fish, bread, cheese, olives, and perhaps some fruit or nuts. For many, especially laborers, this was food eaten on the go, sometimes bought from a vendor. Then there was hesperisma, a light snack eaten in the late afternoon, functioning as a bridge between ariston and the big evening meal. It was minor enough that some sources barely elaborate on it beyond bread, olives, dried fruit. This was clearly not a course anyone considered noteworthy, just something to hold you over. The main event was deipnon, the evening meal, taken at nightfall. This was the largest and most important meal of the day, a time for family and social connection. For the poor, deipnon might consist of vegetable and bean soups, porridge, or perhaps some eggs or a cheap sausage. For the wealthy, however, deipnon could be the start of a multi-course banquet that would last for hours. Everything the Greeks ate revolved around the core staples that the land could reliably provide. The Mediterranean triad was the bedrock of their diet and their economy. First, there were grains. Barley was the most common, as it was much easier to grow in the Greek climate. It was used to make simple barley cakes called maza, as well as porridges and stews. Wheat, which is more sensitive to drought, was more difficult to cultivate and thus more expensive. While it was grown in Greece, it was also imported, and fine white bread was a luxury, often reserved for the upper classes. Thus, the poor more typically ate coarse brown breads made from barley, which were filling but a clear marker of their social standing. Next came the olive. The olive tree was, according to myth, a gift from the goddess Athena herself, and its oil was liquid gold. Olive oil had a huge number of uses. It was a primary source of fat, used for cooking, flavoring dishes, and dressing vegetables. It was also used beyond consumption. For example, the Greeks would bathe with it and use it as fuel for lamps. It was such a serious economic asset to Athens that Solon's laws, enacted in 594 BCE, made olive oil the only agricultural product Athenians were legally permitted to export. Everything else had to stay domestic. That's a striking regulatory detail. Essentially, one commodity was treated as valuable enough to be the sole exception to an export ban. And finally, there was wine, a gift from the god Dionysus. Wine was a universal staple consumed by people from all walks of life. but they drank it very differently than we often do today. Drinking wine straight or undiluted was widely considered barbaric, a sign of a lack of self-control. Instead, they typically mixed it with water, especially in formal settings like a symposium, often in a ratio of 1 part wine to 3 parts water, though this could vary. This diluted wine was consumed with meals, providing calories. It was also sometimes flavored with honey, spices, or even pine resin, which is the ancestor of modern Retsina wine. Beyond the core triad, the Greek diet was surprisingly varied, though heavily dependent on social class. Vegetables and legumes were incredibly important. Lentil soup was a classic workman's dish, and they also ate chickpeas, fava beans, onions, garlic, cabbage, and radishes. These plant-based foods, along with bread, formed the bulk of the calories for the majority of the population. Fruits and nuts were also popular, especially figs, grapes, raisins, and walnuts. Concerning protein, there was a sharp divide. Meat was a luxury. As an example to illustrate its cost, a piglet could cost 3 days' wages for a public servant, making fresh meat prohibitively expensive for most. For common people, meat was usually eaten during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed and the meat was distributed. Otherwise, their protein came from cheaper sources. Sausages made from entrails were known, as was tripe. Seafood, on the other hand, was much more common, especially for communities near the coast. Octopus, squid, and fresh fish like sea bass were enjoyed by those who could afford them. For the inland poor, salted and dried fish like anchovies and sardines were a vital and more affordable source of protein that was widely traded. Dairy products came primarily from goats and sheep, as cows were not well suited to the rugged landscape. Cheese was a staple for all classes, and there were many forms available. It could be made by curdling milk with various coagulants. They also consumed a sour fermented milk product called oxygala, likely similar to modern yogurt. Butter, however, does not seem to have been popular. It was seemingly associated with outsiders, the barbaroi. The food of ancient Greece perfectly illustrates the deep social divisions of the time, from humble daily fare to the infamous austerity of a Spartan warrior and the decadent feasts of the Athenian elite. One of the most fascinating examples is kykeon. At its most basic, it was a mixed drink of water, barley, and sometimes wine, cheese, or herbs. It appears in the epic poems of Homer as a restorative for heroes, and seems to have been a simple drink consumed by various classes. But kykeon may have had a much more profound role. It was the sacred drink used to break a fast at the climax of the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most secret religious rites in ancient Greece. Some scholars have hypothesized that the barley used for the ritual kykeon was infected with a psychoactive fungus called ergot, which would have induced powerful visions in the initiates. This theory remains speculative, but it suggests the drink may have been a key to a mystical experience. In stark contrast to this stood one of ancient Greece's most famous dishes, the Spartan melas zomos, or black soup. This was the quintessential food of the austere, militaristic Spartan society. Made from boiled pig's legs, blood, salt, and vinegar, it was designed for sustenance and to reinforce discipline. There is a famous legend of a visitor from the luxurious city of Sybaris who tried it and remarked, "Now I know why the Spartans aren't afraid of dying." Indeed, the Spartan diet was regarded throughout Greece as bland and harsh. It's worth mentioning, though, that the use of blood in cuisine sounds strange to some, but it is nutritious and common in the cuisines of many countries today. Finally, we have the symposium, the famous Greek drinking party. This was the domain of wealthy, aristocratic men. The evening would begin with the deipnon, the dinner, which for them included a wider variety of dishes. But the meal was just the prelude. After the food tables were cleared, the symposium proper began. A large vessel called a crater was filled with wine and water, and a symposiarch, or master of the party, was chosen to decide the strength of the mixture. As they drank, they would snack on trajamata, things like toasted beans, dried fruit, or honey cakes, and engage in philosophical debate, listen to music, and enjoy entertainment. The symposium was the ultimate expression of elite Greek culture, a world away from the barley bread and lentil soup of the common citizen. The food of ancient Greece was a story of contrasts. It was a story of frugality and necessity, built on the enduring foundation of grains, olives, and wine, and supplemented by crucial legumes and vegetables. It was a diet that fueled farmers, soldiers, and philosophers alike, reflecting a culture that valued simplicity. Yet, it was also a story of social status, where a simple meal stood in stark opposition to the elaborate rituals of the symposium. From a potentially psychoactive brew to the blood soup of a warrior state, food was more than just sustenance. It was a powerful expression of identity, belief, and social structure. The legacy of this diet is still with us. The emphasis on olive oil, fresh vegetables, legumes, and fish is a clear precursor to the modern Mediterranean diet, widely celebrated for its health benefits. But the ancient Greeks understood the power of simple, local ingredients, a lesson that has echoed through millennia.